great to see so many of you here for what's going to be, I think, spectacular. All right, forget that I said that.
Setting the bar high.
What is going to be so much fun with Kristin LeMay here. I'm Jane Wald. I'm the executive director of the Emily Dickinson Museum, and I have wanted to see if Kristin could come here to Amherst ever since I read her terrific book, I Told My Soul to Sing, Finding God with Emily Dickinson. I have just a very brief anecdote about how this book has come to mean quite a lot to me, and that is that some time ago, maybe way back in the winter, I think, I was asked by the Christian Formation and Education Committee at Grace Church, where I attend church, to talk about Dickinson. And the general theme of this series was a sustainable faith. And so when I was asked, I think it was Patty back there toward the back of the room, when she asked me if I could talk about that, I think I may have burst out laughing. Emily Dickinson, a sustainable faith? You've got to be kidding. But because I had just read Kristin's book, I could, it was a little bit easier to maneuver between the various poles that Emily Dickinson set out about her own spiritual life throughout her writings, her poetry, and her letters, and her own, what we know of her own experience, so that there need not be an adjective like sustainable applied to her faith or ours at all, in a sense. I mean, that's just my one of the things that I brought away from this wonderful book. So I Told My Soul to Sing, to me, kind of is I think it is a sort of journey that each one of us has taken or has taken part of. A lot of I found a lot of the things that Kristin could articulate, things that had been sleeping in my head that I would never have been able to say. So I am just so glad that Kristin has done so. So Kristin LeMay has studied at Harvard Divinity School and at Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And her translation of Francois Beaumont's Last Days of Jesus was published by Westminster, the John Knox Press. She's done other work, and some of that has appeared in Tri-Quarterly and the Harvard Theological Review and the Cresset and other periodicals. Now she teaches writing at Ohio University in the Appalachian foothills, and she is here with her husband Eric, and we are just so happy to welcome Kristin LeMay.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you to Cindy and to Lucy and everybody at the Dickinson Homestead and Museum for having me here today. It's really, I feel like I'm going to geek out a little bit, but it is really unbelievably fantastic and cool. This has been just a really long journey for me of reading Dickinson and loving Dickinson, and in many ways it actually kind of started here. The first vacation I ever took as an adult, that I sort of decided to go out and buy a plane ticket and go somewhere, this is where I came. So everybody else went to Mexico or the beach or something like that. And I was like, I'm going to Harvard to look at the desk, and I'm going to go to the homestead. And it was amazing. And so to come full circle back here all these years later, it's really, I kind of have the shivers. So it's an amazing culmination to be able to share some thoughts and to talk about Dickinson with you all here in this space that she lived and wrote. And I know I'm not alone in seeing the homestead as a place of pilgrimage. Right? I'm sure if you guys are local, you're probably used to seeing people kind of wandering around the town, you know, maybe standing on the lawn looking up at her bedroom window with this kind of reverent look about them. Maybe even imagine that a few of you here have looked reverently a time or two, perhaps. You know, we wander the town, we try to find the site of the original house, and of course we visit her grave, which I was amazed the first time I went to see, decorated like a saint's shrine, right? Tokens, pebbles, above all, poems. And I think that this is one of the really incredible things about Dickinson is the devotion, and I'm using that word intentionally, like the devotion that she inspires in her readers. Depending on the circles you travel in, I think you'll hear her touted as many different kinds of hero. To some people, I think she's sort of a feminist hero. To some people, she's a personal hero. To writers, she's a writerly hero. When I look at a place like Amazon.com, right, you read the reviews, and I love that people write in reviews of the complete poems of Emily Dickinson. That makes me happy. And I'm amazed in the number of the comments that I come across that have some version of the sentiment, "I swear I am Emily Dickinson reincarnated." I read that a lot. And then the other one, which I find even more telling, is the people who write in and they say, "She gets me." Right? Something about the poetry, she gets me. And I think there's something true. I think there's something true in this, that readers who immerse themselves in Dickinson's work, they tend to do so, I should say maybe we tend to do so, because we long to find out more about her, absolutely. And also because we have this sense that somehow in reading her, we're going to find out more about ourselves, about what it means to live, about what it means to love, about what it means to die. Right? I think that we read Dickinson much in the way that we approach other works of great genius, for the impossible, incandescent beauty of them all on their own, yes, and also because we read them to learn about ourselves. And this is the way that, one of the major ways this book of mine came about. As much as it's a portrait of elements of Emily Dickinson's spiritual life, it's also a portrait of mine, as she helped to reveal it to me. And this personal tack that I take in the book is one of the reasons that I, in this very tongue-in-cheek way, refer to her as Saint Emily. And I want to call her Saint Emily, sort of tongue-in-cheek, because I want to call her Emily in these pages and in this talk, for the same reason that we call the saints, Teresa, Jude, Thomas, right? We don't call saints by their last names. And so it puts us on a footing of intimacy and companionship. Dickinson is an object of scholarly study, and I think Emily stands alongside us in thinking about the subjects that matter most to us on a deeply personal level. So that's the deeper reason for this little sleight of hand, this verbal sleight of hand that I do with St. Emily, because the book grows out of the realization that for many, many years I'd been turning to Emily the way that other people turn to the saints, right? For wisdom about the ultimate questions I couldn't answer by myself. And over years of reading and copying out and memorizing and reciting and wandering over and studying and reading what other people had to say about her poetry, I came to realize that I was treating her poetry a little bit differently than the way some other people do, that I was kind of treating it as my own personal scripture. So there are many, many a sunny day I would find myself walking down the street and I'd be reciting to myself, you know, "Perhaps I ask too large, I take no less than skies, for earths grow thick as berries in my native town." Like other people might have some pop song on their head, pop song lyrics. Or when I was having, you know, a tough day, church felt very alienating, and I was struggling to pray, it was her words that I would find springing to my lips, right? "Thou shalt not is a kinder sword than from a disappointing God. Disciple, call again." You know, or on a really bad day, disciples then knew where they went. They went to God's right hand. That hand is amputated now, and God cannot be found. Whereas, of course, the Bible would have, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But Emily's had become the words I was using to process and understand my own experience. And there's just one problem with the saint I had chosen to turn to, or that had chosen me, or I don't know. And it's the problem that Jane has already alluded to. And it's a problem that some of you may have come in today kind of crinkling your brow at, in a talk to be about finding God with Emily Dickinson. And that problem is that a lot of readers do not actually think that Dickinson found God at all. They don't believe that she was a Christian. So I just want to read you a little short passage from the introduction that lays out and alludes to this dilemma. Right. In her lifetime, the state of Emily's soul was called into question when she staunchly refused to give the public profession of faith that marked conversion, and it was further suspected when she stopped attending church altogether. In the 100+ years since her poetry was published, her soul has increasingly been the subject of debate. Was she a Christian? Did she believe in God? If so, how so? If not, why not? The answers readers give to these questions couldn't be more varied. If you look around at the library or online, you'll find a range of readers assigning Emily to every possible spot on the spiritual spectrum. Reluctant Christian, ardent mystic, atheist, agnostic, Buddhist. Emily's spiritual life inspires so many diverse answers because her poems and letters offer such tricky evidence. By turns and by moods, Emily challenges, cudgels, and coos at the god she dubs with an infinite variety of nicknames. And I just want to name a couple of them here because it's suggestive of the scope of this interaction. Right? So she calls God the foreigner, that bold person God, itself, the imperceptible, tyranny, a mastiff, old suitor heaven, vagabond, sorcerer from Genesis, and the mysterious bard, among other more generic names like the sky, might, deity, and omnipotence. And this is not to mention her broad use of those more traditional names for God: Lord, Savior, Maker, Jehovah, Sovereign, Creator, Redeemer, and Almighty. God alone is the 39th most frequently occurring word in her poems. As the presence of these names attests, she wrote amply on the subject, alternately irreverent and pious, sometimes in a single poem, even in a single verse. Right, take the poem with the first lines beginning, "Papa above, regard a mouse." It's a prayer of sorts, spoken to the Papa above, but the tongue-in-cheek diction of Papa and mouse prevents it from feeling particularly devout. So we wonder, is she pointing out the childishness of faith through this mousy charade, or might her playful tone hint at intimacy with her divine Papa, the way that biblical scholars say Jesus' intimacy with translates more closely as dad, even daddy, than the formal English father that we're more familiar with. The letters raise the same questions, right? When she says home is the definition of God, does she mean that God is her home, or the reverse, that an earthly home is God enough, no other deity required? So this challenge of trying to actually understand Emily's spiritual life was absolutely a fascinating puzzle. Again, as Jane's alluded to, there's so many layers of remove between us and anything like a clear, perceptible statement of beliefs. I mean, she's writing poetry, not a creed, right? She's not listing her beliefs one after another. And then, as any reader of Dickinson knows, she loved to try on hats and moods and stances and voices. Right? She famously cautions Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who goes on to publish her poetry after her death, "When I state myself as representative of the verse, it does not mean me, but a supposed person. So I is no guarantee that it equals Emily." And then finally, time moves on, right? There's no guarantee that what looks like a stable utterance of belief or a stable utterance of a desire for belief at 15 hadn't radically shifted by, say, the time she was 30. That's a lot of challenges. And then on the other hand, there's this fascinating invitation of the poems and letters kind of urging us and inviting us toward discovery. I kept at it, in part because the question of Emily's interior life wasn't just a scholarly conundrum that occupied my mind. For me, it became a spiritual conundrum that occupied my soul, because I was asking through Emily's life and work those most important questions I was wrestling with. Do I still believe in God? Why do I pray? Should I pray? Right? What happens when we die? Is there a life after this one? And discerning what Emily thought of these matters was this slightly safer way to figure out what I thought of them, though it actually ends up not being all that safe, it turns out. In many ways, actually, you know, her inconsistency in talking about them was consoling. That more than anything else was consoling, because her God sort of shape-shifts from day to day, and I find that that's very much the way it happens for me. One day God is the stranger, and the next day God is awful Father of love, that really weighted phrase, and then another day God just sort of seems like this abstract idea in someone else's belief system. So I was reading Emily, and Emily was reading me. She proposes, God seems much more friendly through a hearty lens, and she was my lens. She says, oh, what a comrade is human thought, all our friends on a spar. I was nowhere more on the spar, nowhere more stranded and adrift than in my struggles with prayer. And it was this issue above all that I brought to Emily and laid at her feet. In fact, the original title for this book was Because She Cannot Pray. the editor nixed it, because he thought it was too negative, and because it started with because. I guess he didn't like. But because she cannot pray, that's actually how I thought of this project for the longest time, because I couldn't pray. And the phrase comes from a letter that Emily wrote to her cousins Frances and Louisa Norcross. She invites them as she leaves them at the end of a letter. She says, "Let Emily sing for you because she cannot pray." And I've always heard the key term is this because, which is that she offers her songs as this corrective, a sort of alternative to the inability to pray. And it's this connection between song and prayer that the book in many ways explores, and that we'll be exploring today. Because it turns out that Emily's poems don't just express her religious experience and belief, they actually shape it. And so in looking at how she sang, we'll see something of the way she prayed. And I'll share a couple of thoughts about the way that these songs have opened up new avenues of prayer for even one as hindered in it as me. So before we get to the song, we'll spend a moment with that cannot, because she cannot pray, and then we'll see sort of some of the solutions. I want to say just a word about her religious struggles and the contours of that resistance that she absolutely expressed throughout her life. As many of you probably know, right in the 1840s and 50s, New England went through a series of small awakenings that tore not so smallly through the communities of which Emily was a part. Her family, her friends, her town. It seemed like everyone around her was converting to Christianity, yet she staunchly refused to give that public confession of faith that was considered to mark conversion. So her letters, there are these clusters of letters that report again and again on her uncomfortable solitary position on the outside of the fold of faith. She writes, "I am standing alone in rebellion." Or again, she says, in a cheekier mood, "I am one of the lingering bad ones." You guys may or may not know that famous story, possibly apocryphal, from the Dickinson mythology, which I actually quite like. And it literally enacts this solitary stance of rebellion. You literally see her standing alone, right? She's 16, away not too far at boarding school at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. And it's a few days before Christmas. The headmistress, Miss Lyon, has decided that she wants to impress upon the girls the importance of increased devotion during the sacred season. So she calls all the girls together in the school's assembly hall, and she asks that all the girls who are willing to spend Christmas Day in fasting and prayer should stand as a sign of their consent. Everybody stands up, with the exception of a few lingering bad ones who stay seated. Emily is among the lingering bad ones. So Miss Lyon, I imagine her kind of getting a little more stern in the face at this, and so she increases the demand, and she says that everyone who wishes to be a Christian should sit. Keep in mind, Emily is already sitting down, so as everybody sits down, Emily alone stands up. So she later quips about this act of rebellion. "They all thought it queer. I thought a lie would be queerer." She liked to retell this story. That's how I take the way it's come down to us. I think she must have liked to retell this story about her singular resistance to conversion in the same way that she boasts about it in her letters. But of course, as is always the case with Emily, the truth is more complex. And there are these clusters of letters from 1846 through 1850 that revolve endlessly around this question, and even painfully around this question of conversion. And there's a line in a poem that she later wrote that to me seems to encapsulate this struggle, and I know that for me it encapsulates the struggle of faith, which is, "I could not find my yes." That's another cannot. I could not find my yes. At 15, she professed, "I feel I shall never be happy without I love Christ." But she never could find that yes. Again, she said, "I continually hear Christ saying to me, 'Daughter, give me thine heart.'" But she couldn't say yes. As her wonderful poetic diction has it later, in fact, I think I saw this printed on a board in the hall, "Narcotics cannot still the tooth that nibbles at the soul." And that tooth never stopped nibbling. She never did convert, not in the way that we tend to think of as conversion, as a single confession of faith that binds us to a persistent truth ever thereafter, much like taking a vow. In fact, her father, Edward Dickinson, you all probably know, a lawyer, he experienced exactly that kind of dramatic shift. He carried around with him until the day he died in his pocket a slip of paper on which he had written a date, May 1st, 1873. And under the date he had written, "I hereby give myself to God." A lawyer, he wrote up his conversion as a contract. But Emily's life and poetry reveals a different kind of conversion, a different form of conversion, I would argue, as a process of wrestling and struggling that isn't the opposite of faith, right? You either convert or you don't, but that wrestling and struggling is faith, that is a form of faith. And where those of a sacred bent work out their conversion in church, through worship, through prayer, through acts of service, Emily practiced this conversion in her own sacred space, through poetry. I think it's a cool thing that our English word conversion shares its root with the word verse. They both come from the Latin convertere, which actually at its root means just to turn. And this is the kind of conversion Emily knew in verse. This turning and returning around the questions that most baffled her. At 15, that peak moment of wrestling, she wrote, "I am alone before my little writing desk. I am alone before God." And throughout the next 40 years, that desk was the site of the struggle, where she took up those doubts and questions that prevented her from saying yes and wrestled with them, turning them into poems that revolve endlessly back around these questions of doubt and faith, Christ and God, eternity and the grave. I think you could call Emily actually the most enthused convert of all, because she never stopped turning and turning and turning around those questions that other people said yes to. So what about prayer? Right, we're back at that central denial and invitation. Let Emily sing for you because she cannot pray. Now, her denial of prayer in that letter is hardly an isolated incident. And really, she amply insisted that she couldn't pray. So one of my primary struggles in trying to write this book was to figure out, should I believe her? So let me read you just a few of the other instances in which she's absolutely forswearing prayer, and we can see what you think. Because she's pretty insistent. Right? Emily was downright adamant, and persistently so, that she didn't pray. She traces the roots of her inability in a letter to Higginson, stating that she was not reared to prayer. And to Samuel Bowles, she says, "We did not learn to pray." To Helen Hunt Jackson, nursing a broken foot, she excuses herself with something of a boast. "Knew I how to pray, to intercede for your foot were intuitive, but I am a pagan." Her letters not only pronounce her inability to pray on her own, they also testify to how often she bowed out of common prayer. We all know the poem, "Some Keep the Sabbath Going to Church," right? She also forswore in letters. On Sundays, when the family was off at church, she grinned to be home writing letters. "It is Sunday now, John, and all have gone to church, and I have come out in the new grass to listen to the anthems." Again, song, even the song of the crickets and the birds, stands in for prayer. And of the family's daily morning prayer, her reports indicate her mental distance. That famous quote, right? "They are all religious except me," and address an eclipse every morning whom they call their father. The third person plural, they, tells us that she, though present, is otherwise engaged. And this protestation continues in the poems. In that one iconic poem, "I prayed at first a little girl." Prayer doesn't make it past the third line, right? "I prayed at first a little girl because they told me to, but stopped when qualified to guess how prayer would look to me if I believed God looked around each time my childish eye fixed full and steady on his own," right? Stopped happens in the third line. And even when Emily admits to attempting prayer as a kind of last-ditch effort, like in that poem, "My period had come for prayer, no other art would do," she concludes it with the equivocal announcement, "I worshipped, did not pray." And she puts "pray" in between scare quotes, which gives the line a kind of ironic twist, this sort of so-called prayer that other people supposedly pray. She can't attest. Right? She makes it quite clear, you're not going to catch her at that act of prayer that other people are engaged in. And if you look at her most straightforward, what I consider to be her most straightforward, that's a tricky word, but her most straightforward poem on the subject, which is the first poem hopefully printed on the sheet you have in front of you. And if you don't have it, maybe your neighbor has it and you guys can share. This poem hardly looks like it tells a different story. I'm going to read it out. "Prayer is the little implement through which men reach where presence is denied them. They fling their speech by means of it in God's ear. If then he hear, this sums the apparatus comprised in prayer." It is not the poem of someone who loves to pray. Where did this weird language of implement and apparatus come from? I think it sort of makes me feel like we're safety goggles. But there's no warmth in the tone, and there's not a lot of excitement about the enterprise. And I find it actually really instructive in reading this poem to sort of set it in perspective, to put it up against other poems on prayer, which take a very, very different tack. So I want to read just by way of contrast, so kind of hold that tone in your ear. And then I want to read by way of contrast George Herbert's poem on prayer. Do you guys know Prayer 1? This is the one that unspools like 27 different definitions of prayer in a row in this magnificent burst of language. So hear Emily in one ear, and then we're going to hear Herbert in the other. "Prayer, the church's banquet, angels' age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth, engine against the almighty, sinner's tower, reversed thunder, Christ side piercing spear, the 6 days world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear, softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manna, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary, man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. Like, my heart rate is actually elevated by the time I get to the end of the poem. Herbert loves to pray. I mean, you can hear it. It's like, it's ecstatic. By way of contrast, right? I'll read it as excitedly as I can. Prayer is the little implement through which men reach where presence is denied them. They fling their speech by means of it in God's ear. If then he hear, this sums the apparatus comprised in prayer. As was often the case with Emily, even in this extremely skeptical poem about prayer, she tucks another story, right? So if you look back at it on the page, there are two rhyme pairs that chime out through the irony in this poem. In the second and fourth lines, speech, reach, and in the first and second lines of the second stanza, ear, hear. She binds together in rhyme a noun and a verb in each case, speech, reach, and ear, hear, an action and an actor. And I think that the rhymes show, right, that these two things belong together. The speech reaches, God's ear hears, the rhymes tell us that they know no other way. So buried in this very skeptical poem on prayer, there's this tiny little hint of realized prayer. The speech reaches, the ear hears, that's the way the apparatus works. So by tucking this tiny realized prayer of speech reach and ear hear, even inside the very dismissive prayer is the little implement. I think Emily not only reveals that she prays, I think she also reveals how she prays, right? She's not a philosopher. She does not expound her prayer through theories and ideas. She doesn't wrap it in discourse. She's not a preacher. She doesn't expound it through theology, right? She's a poet. She prays in the mode that's available to her. She prays through poetry. She wraps her prayer in hymn meter, right? She wraps it in a hopeful rhyme. She wraps it even in something as small as the careful crafting of a beautiful phrase, the way that, you think about the artisan carving something beautiful in the back of a capital that no one will ever see but God. If she could only scoff in reason, she could pray through rhyme in poetry. This is one glimpse of the ways I think she prays in poetry, through a tiny rhyme tucked in an otherwise cynical poem. In another poem she sighs, "Prayer, the only raiment I should need." And I think that's what the rhyme is. I want to touch down briefly on two other ways that we can see Emily praying in poetry, and these are also ways that address serious challenges that any reader faces in trying to uncover the truth of Emily's interior life. And the first has to do with doubt. We're back at those two poles again, right? How do you reconcile these two poles that are expressed equally vehemently in her work? How to reconcile poems that seem credulous of faith with those that seem dismissive of faith? And then, how do you reconcile this private, varied record of the poems with the interpersonal record of the letters that's written for specific recipients in specific circumstances? From reading about other people writing about Dickinson, my sense is that we, as readers in this moment at least, tend to take as more true expressions of doubt than expressions of faith. I think there's this sort of understanding that religion, to a certain extent for Dickinson, as for people of her moment, was kind of unavoidable. And so if there's this residue of religion in her poetry, it's kind of an environmental effect, like toxicity through lead poisoning or something. She couldn't avoid it. Whereas doubt seems like the individual mind really like fighting and struggling and striving. So we kind of slough off the appearance of belief in some of the poems and in some of the letters, thinking, oh, well, that's for the recipient, or oh, well, she's testing, an idea in the moment. It feels like a knee-jerk kind of reflex, like the Bible. You can hardly get away from it. Other times, of course, the seemingly credulous statements of belief, I think, get tempered by tone, right? So a poem like, "The Savior must have been a docile gentleman to come so far, so cold a night for little fellow men." it's hardly a credulous poem, right? The tone takes what would otherwise be a doctrinal statement about incarnation and actually makes it something of the reverse. Instead of promising us really in sincerity, it sort of lifts one eyebrow and asks, really, you guys buy this? And then there are other poems, and there are other tones that I find harder to dismiss. What do you do when faced with a poem like the second one on the sheet on the right-hand side? Though the great waters sleep, right? As I mentioned, I've taken up this habit of walking around town reciting Emily's poems to myself. And this was in the days before cell phones, when people didn't talk to themselves on the street, so I can only imagine I made something of a spectacle of myself. But this was one poem that I particularly loved to say, and I think it was because of the rhythm of it. It has this kind of rolling rhythm like the tide. And I'm going to just read it to you guys. Though the great waters sleep, that they are still the deep, we cannot doubt. No vacillating God ignited this abode to put it out. I'd say this just over and over to myself as I walked around town. Much I imagine the way that some people recite, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Right? I'd say it over and over. But every time there was this rock in the center of the poem that I felt like I kind of stubbed my toe on and tripped over, which is that central line, we cannot doubt. And every time I'm like, who wrote this? Did Emily write this? Emily, who in another mood, in a lighter mood, right, says, we dignify our faith when we can cross oceans with it, though most prefer ships. Or what do you do with the fact that the same person who wrote we cannot doubt about the afterlife in this poem, we cannot doubt, in darker moods from this same period as those she loved just died in rapid and awful succession, one after another, she wrote to others begging confirmation of what she didn't know herself about the certainty of a life to come. So she writes, a trusted friend, are you certain that there is another life? When overwhelmed to know, I fear that few are sure. She wasn't sure, right? The letters from this same period when she wrote this poem brim over with repeated assertions of spiritual unresolve and skepticism and worry and fear even. But then, the bell of that middle line tolls again, we cannot doubt. And I'm faced with the realization she wrote those words too, so what do we do with them? We know that in her final 3 years, Emily sat at her writing desk, that site of struggle, penning these words at least 7 times. 5 copies for sure, 2 more suspected. That's only the ones we know about. 7 times she wrote this out, she sent it out. And I think that that repetition and that complexity reveals something else about the way that Emily used her poetry as a practice of prayer, as a practice of conversion, which is that she didn't just write what she wanted to believe. I think she also wrote, she didn't just write what she already believed, she wrote what she wanted to believe as well, right? And this practice isn't as weird as it at first seems. I think of the couple exchanging vows at the altar, promising to love each other until death do us part. We don't say those words because we know that we're going to do that. We say them because we hope that somehow saying them is going to make it true, right? So we speak them almost as a prayer, that that will come true. Words have the power not just to express or explain, but also to shape reality. And of course the church has known this for years. I'll just read you another passage. The use of language to convert the soul has a long history, one that goes back a lot further than 1884, when Emily wrote this poem, Though the Great Waters Sleep. In fact, such a belief in the power of words rests at the root of repetitive prayer, a practice developed over centuries by monastics in the East. The strict hesychasts, following a prayer tradition in the Eastern Church that dates back to the 4th century, speak only the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Other contemplatives choose to repeat the name, Jesus Christ, or a verse from the Psalms. As they speak the chosen words in constant repetition, they interpret that scriptural instruction to bind God's words upon the arm, between the fingers, about the head, to write them upon the table of thine heart. And this familiar instruction, in fact, made its way to Emily's fingers. In 1845, when she was 14, she embroidered a sampler, ending in the prayer to Jesus, and write thy name thyself upon her heart. Repetitive prayer practice aims to create stillness of mind, much in the same way wordless meditation does, but repetitive prayer also hopes to weave the repeated words into the fabric of the soul. The idea is that through this repetition, the words will cease to be a hoped-for belief to become instead intrinsic to the one who speaks them and re-speaks them. So Emily rewrote this poem, not because she knew of her lost friends that they are still the deep, but because she wished to know it. She wished to believe beyond a doubt that her own self would not dissolve when she entered into the great waters, when she too was plunged beneath the recall-less sea, as she names it in another place. So from the depths of her desire, she wrote this poem, and then she rewrote it, and she copied it, and I don't doubt that she spoke it to herself, perhaps, in the still watches of the night. Her cousin Louisa relates the memory of peeping into the pantry and watching Emily reciting her poetry to herself as she skimmed the milk, a homely image that could come straight from the manuals of the hesychasts, who blended work and prayer and words into a single experience aimed to make recited prayer as instinctive and intrinsic to the self as breath. So I think that Emily rocked herself upon this poem's rhythm, using it to sound within herself its promises of faith, much the same way water spins whirls into the sand beneath the waves. Emily lived with her poems year, and a monk lives with the psalter, right, as texts to live by. And I turn to her poems in the same way, right, that practice of repeating them, repetitive prayer. The key difference is that for Emily, her poems were never finished, or rarely finished. I think one of the things that's so fascinating about her processes of revision is the way she returns to poems after a long time, and suddenly there's a new final stanza, or suddenly there's only the final stanza, right? Or she'll write an alternate word in above a verse in a new, different hand. It'll be in pencil instead of in pen. When an editor, Thomas Niles from Roberts Brothers in Boston, asked her to send him a poem, she reached back 20 years to pick one. So there's this clear sense that the poems lived for her long past the moment when she wrote them. And it's clear through this kind of interactive practice of returning to them that they were spaces of conversations with beliefs that she would return to. She'd tinker with a line, and that too is a form of conversion. Another way of turning and returning around the poems, the questions that the poems hold. I'll just name this because I think it's so cool. I don't know if you guys know the poem, The Infinite a Sudden Guest has been assumed to be, but how can that stupendous come, which never went away, which never goes away? The poem is actually composed out of two distinct scraps of paper, which are held together by a pin. I think that she wrote the first two lines, right, this sort of challenge, the infinite a sudden guest has been assumed to be, kind of like, well, come on. And then wrote the second set of lines and pinned the poem together when the answer came. So there's this conversational sense of living through the words of the poems. I want to just mention one final element of Emily's poetic modes of prayer. And this is one that matters to me a lot as an individual. And it's the way that her prayer can be held in something as seemingly incongruous as laughter. People who don't read Dickinson are sometimes surprised to learn that she had an amazing sense of humor. They think she was gloomy. We know better, right? And she was never so jocular and so teasing as she was with God. In a rare moment of possible transparency, she maybe gives us the reason for this. She says, "The truth I do not dare to know, I muffle with a jest." So for all her true anxiety and concerns about salvation and damnation, she can jest in a lighter mood, right? "I hope God will forgive me, as he'll have to many times if he lives long enough." Right, or that wonderful poem, "God is indeed a jealous God. He cannot bear to see that we had rather not with him, but with each other play." Right? She teases, she says, "I believe that the love of God may be taught not to seem like bears." So while the mood of the moment is this kind of tiptoeing around at this sleeping bear of the Almighty, Emily swaggers a lot more freely out of love. And a lot of readers encounter these plentiful kind of jests and jokes and assume that Emily's making fun of faith. Isn't it stupid, right, that people are so absurd in believing this stuff? And I see it another way. I mean, I see how she's having fun with faith. So in her constant fun with the infinitely wise and merry New Testament, that's her word, infinitely wise and merry, in that constant nicknaming of God, even the sort of snarky names like vagabond or the stranger or tyranny, right? In her mock prayers and in her teasing of the metaphors of faith, folds and flocks and fiery pits, Emily reveals more mischievous and subtle ways to pray than just with folded hands and a bowed head, right? In a letter, I love this, she says, "Unless we become as rogues, we cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." And she also, she adds another beatitude to Jesus's. She says, "Blessed are they who play, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Right? So she plays and she prays informally. She says, "Say, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, hast thou no arm for me?" And she prays irreverently, "Grant me, O Lord, a sunny mind, thy windy will to bear." And she prays joyously in nature, right? In the name of the bee and of the butterfly and of the breeze, amen. She plays rowdily, the way that siblings play rowdily, out of love. So I want to leave you guys with one of her rowdy poems, which is on the back. And this one has a bird in it, who I think gives us a final little glimpse of the poetic prayer. The bobolink is gone, the rowdy of the meadow, and no one swaggers now but me. The Presbyterian birds can now resume the meeting he gaily interrupted that overflowing day when, opening the Sabbath in their afflictive way, he bowed to heaven instead of earth and shouted, "Let us pray." The end.
Will you take some questions?
Happily.
If there are some.
Yeah.
I'll only ask because I'm returning my vast ignorance here. You said you referred to God as a place?
Well, home is one of the definitions. Is that what you're asking?
Oh,
me?
God, the home?
Yeah, so home is the definition of God, is one of her lines, yeah.
I just want to put out a word for one religious tradition you did not name check, which was Judaism.
Yeah.
And Jewish mysticism in the Kabbalah refers to God sometimes as Makom, the place.
Wow.
So I just was hearing a lot about the resonances with Judaism as the humorousness,
yeah.
Tevye. There's a relationship, and the repetitious quality of the prayer. When you talk about binding, there's the tradition of actually taking a strip of prayer and wrapping it around your head and your arm, a full strip of leather.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a wonderful. And I think it's an amazing thing to think about the placeness too of the idea of sacred space in this place in particular. It's quite poignant. So thank you.
Did you write your book from the attitude of you had your belief and you're using Emily to solidify it? Or were you writing it from the point of you were questioning and you identified with Emily's questioning?
That's a really nice question.
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, she wanted to know if I wrote the book from a position of having my beliefs and looking to Emily in some ways to solidify them, or whether I wrote it more from a position of questioning and looking to Emily to sort of challenge them and intervene and help me to move towards some kind of closure. And in some ways, I kind of want to say both. That's the easy answer. I mean, I think that I experienced a dramatic conversion when I was 15 years old, so I kept hearing that sort of, the Emily is wrestling with these questions of her belief at the exact same moment in her life when I had this sudden experience of revelation and realization, and suddenly you could say, I'm a Christian. And the difference is Emily was like, nope, I'm not a Christian, right? And so as I aged as an adult, and what was once absolutely fixed and solid, and I thought, I know exactly who I am forever, thank God. What an amazing gift I've been given. As that became a little shaky, and as some of the beliefs that I initially had been ready to go to the stake for, as those things started to feel a little bit less settled, I think that I was struggling with how to process that youthful experience and whether or not that was still true for me. And so I think in many ways, one of the things about Emily that resonated so much for me was that she had this youthful identity as someone who was longing to be a Christian. And I wanted to see, was that still true for her as she aged? Because, gosh, if she could still say, what I thought at 15 still matters for me now, then in some ways maybe that would give me something like an answer. And then I also think that there's something in the way that she fought, which was so intelligently and so uncompromisingly, that really appealed to me, because I felt like I could kind of lean on her to think about the hard stuff, and read those poems as a way of challenging the things that I was worried I didn't know what to think about anymore. Yeah.
Did Emily Dickinson read about other religions? Did she know much about other religions?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, she asked whether Emily Dickinson read about other religions or knew about other religions. I don't know. I mean, my sense is that her religious education was very strong in Christianity. I don't know the extent to which those other traditions would have entered. Actually, you guys are restoring the library. You might be able to answer about whether there were volumes in there that would give her access to that. I don't find a presence that suggests that was woven through her thought and her work in the same way that Christianity is.
Yeah, I could add, well, she seemed, there are suggestions, especially in her poetry, that she was quite familiar with Catholicism. And in the family libraries, there were copies of the Koran, both at the homestead and at the Evergreens.
Okay. And there's a really strong sacramental language, for sure, that's woven through the poems, right? The idea of sacrament is enormous. And so that's one of the ways that Catholicism gets filtered into the poems.
I was thinking about Lydia Maria Child, who wrote about different religions. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What did you say?
Lydia Marie Child, at that same moment, kind of.
What?
Yeah, yeah.
What do you think when she said, I never spoke with God nor visited in heaven, but certain am I of the spot as if the chart were given. So she has a map to heaven and God.
Yeah.
Is she playing?
There's that certainty again, right? I always, anytime there's any kind of direct assurance, I'm like looking for her on the other hand, being like, no, not just kidding. Because I don't think that certainty is so compelling and yet so hard won and so hard to find. Right, one of the things that I love about that poem is that I never saw. Right, so I think there's two ways you could read the poem. You could also read, I never met God. Right? I never actually had that exposure in the same way that some people do. Some people, right, walk with God in the garden. I never saw him, or I never saw the sea. I also think even, I mean, I'm close to reading the poem on the spot here, but, right, that as if, it still feels hypothetical to me. As if the check were given, or as if the spots were given. Yeah, so I would say that that's one of those poems that maybe leads really strong with that line of certainty, but I bet if we looked at it closely, we could find a way that she was actually kind of putting some question mark in there. But there certainly are poems that sound very faithful. There's no doubt about it, and I think we put that in that camp. Right? I mean, isn't faith one of the categories in the initial publication of the poem? There's, in the initial publications, that there's those section headings. There's a lot of them. And that was actually one of the worst struggles in the book. I was saying this to Jane, was trying to figure out, you only can have, so many poems, which ones to have. And I think I drove my editor absolutely wildly insane, because every single time he would give me another version, I would just like insert more Dickinson quotes until it was like I had to stop myself at some points. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
This isn't exactly a question, but you can speculate on it. When she says that when she's writing, she's with God, I'm wondering if her sense of God is not that very interior sense of sureness and integrity that, all writers, Faulkner, Proust, they weren't I in their work, and people would ask Faulkner, well, how could you write that? Well, how do you judge that? And he said, I don't judge the voices, I just have to get them out faithfully. And that is what I think, when she says she's with God, she has a sure inner sense that the words that come out, she just has to get them right. And that's her faith, that she can do that. It's given to her again and again and again. There's no doubt, and it happens more and more and more. It's a tremendous gift, and that's the God that I think she definitely has faith in.
Well, I love the idea that in that poem, right, the soul that hath a guest doth seldom go abroad, right, diviner guest at home obviate the need, right. I love the idea that that diviner guest is actually that sense of the self, or that sense of truth that's coming up from within. Yeah.
The kingdom of God is within you.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Kristin, but before we get to thank her again, I just want to let you know or remind you that her book is for sale out in our museum shop, and that Kristin has kindly agreed to sign books, and we can continue conversation out there. There are also refreshments on the porch immediately adjacent to the shop, so we hope that all of you will stay around for a little bit to explore some of these notions further. This has been a real treat for all of us, and I thank you for coming.
Now I want to go to your